So I've known Elisa for several years. So Elisa did her PhD at the ICN at UCL with Patrick Haggard, where she studied inhibition and voluntary action. And she then got some funding to go to visit Columbia University before going on to a postdoctoral position at the Max Planck Institute in Berlin. And then in 2015, she transitioned to become a PI there. So she's now a junior group leader funded by a Freigeist Fellowship at the Bernstein Center for Computational Neuroscience and the Institute of Psychology at the Humboldt University in Berlin. So as you'll see, Elisa focuses on, I guess, the other end of metacognition to what we're, I guess, have sometimes seen in this talk series. So we've often seen talks on perceptual metacognition. Elisa studies motor metacognition. I think you'll see this intersection between motor metacognition and agency really sheds light on fundamental issues in consciousness science. So we're really excited that you've been able to join us today, Elisa, and yeah, please take it away.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Really, I really mean it. Thanks so much for the introduction invitation, and it really is a pleasure to be part of the seminar series. So I'll be talking, as you said, about motor metacognition and agency. And I've been working on motor metacognition for the past 3 or 4 years. And I've been trying to avoid working on agency for the same amount of time, but I have been unsuccessfully trying to avoid it. And I hope that by the end of the talk, this will become clear why. Before I start, I want to say that all the work that I'm going to present today was done by two of my PhD students, Marika Constant and Angeliki Sharampaki. So all the credit is to them, and any mistakes are mine. So just to start, you all know, many of you here will know that when we talk about metacognition, we typically refer to this kind of operationalization of a task, where we show participants a visual stimulus, in this case, a Gabor patch that's slightly tilted to the right or to the left. We ask participants to do a discrimination decision about that Gabor patch, and then ask them for a measure of confidence. And we measure metacognitive ability as the relationship between confidence and performance in the first order task. And this is a typical metacognitive task, and I think it's very good. As Steve said, it's visual stimuli is what people tend to use. And it's, of course, very convenient. It's the easiest or most straightforward kind of stimulus to manipulate. And we can generate really elegant tasks with this. But when I started working on motor metacognition, I was motivated by the fact that I thought that there's no reason in principle why we should put all of our efforts as a research community only on visual stimuli. So visual information is by no means the only kind of information that the brain can monitor. And maybe we can use this very strong, very elegant operationalization of metacognition to study other kinds of cognition. And my mouse keeps going to the wrong place. In particular, I thought that motor metacognition would be a good or an interesting research direction because it allows us to answer quite a few interesting questions. One of them is, how explicit is motor monitoring? So by this I mean the following. We know that we can walk and talk and gesticulate and fence and make very, very precise movements without necessarily paying attention to them, being aware of what exactly each part of our body is doing, and or explicitly being able to report that. But maybe the question is, how explicit can that access be? Is there any kind of motor control that is in principle opaque to our introspective access? And are there movements that can, or aspects of the movements that can only be controlled by the brain without us being able to explicitly report? Another question is how helpful this explicit monitoring is. So think about another kind of skilled motor control. Think about learning to play an instrument. If you're learning to play the guitar, it seems like at the beginning, yeah, it's important to know where you're putting your fingers on the fret. But at some point, it's actually more productive and more beneficial to stop thinking about how you're moving your fingers and really think about the music you want to produce. So again, this question of the interplay between explicit monitoring and motor performance, I think it's interesting, and you can only answer that in the motor domain. And another reason, more from a different side, why I think studying motor metacognition is interesting is because it allows us to answer the question about domain generality versus domain specificity. And that question goes like this: is there a single monitoring system in the brain that monitors all of our cognitive life, or does each cognitive mechanism has its own inbuilt monitoring system? And again, if we focus only on perceptual studies, we can only answer that question to some extent. But if we start taking the same powerful metacognitive operationalization and apply it to other domains of metacognition, I think we can learn from each other. And how much do we know about all these questions? Well, we know a bit, and this slide is probably a little bit outdated, and there have been a couple of more studies in the past few years, but I think we still agree that motor monitoring might not be very explicit. So the seminal studies by Jeannereau have shown that participants can make a movement and adapt to perturbations of that movement without being able to explicitly report that there was a perturbation or that they have adapted to it. So there really seems to be an unreportable monitoring system. That is, and in a way that also shows that motor information is perhaps noisy because it's overridden by visual information. And from the other perspective, there has been a little bit more recent, a study that was a little bit more recent. This is from Patrick Volmier's lab that came out in 2015, where they tried to revamp the Jeannereau paradigm. So what they did was do more or less the same, ask participants to also draw a straight line. In some trials, introduce a deviation or a perturbation to that movement, and ask participants to detect whether there had been a deviation, yes or no, and then give a measure of confidence. So perhaps you start to recognize that in this study, what they did was take this otherwise a little bit more standard motor paradigm and squeeze it into a metacognitive structure, into the structure of a metacognitive experiment. This is a detection task, not a discrimination task. And what they found here was that the regions in the brain whose gray matter volume correlated with performance in this task were different from those that had been reported in other studies as correlating with visual metacognition. So this study was pretty nice, but I do take it as preliminary evidence. I think there are a couple of issues so I take it as preliminary evidence to show that the neurocorrelates of motor metacognition might not match those of perceptual metacognition. But this is more or less the place where we're at. And whenever I talk about these kinds of studies, I'm asked the question, well, are you just studying agency? I mean, we are calling this motor metacognition, but we know many people have been studying agency for a long time. And I consistently answer, no, I'm not studying agency. But if you think about it, it really is a very valid point. In agency research, we typically think about the comparator model, whereby when we issue a motor command, we also generate an efference copy. And with that, we can predict what the sensory input will be following the movement that we intended to make. If that predicted sensory input matches what actually happens and our observed sensory input, then we say, yes, that was me. There is no mismatch between what I expected, what happened, and what actually happened. So I must have been in control of my body and the world around it. And if there is a mismatch, then we say, well, I don't know how I moved, but whatever I wanted to do was not the cause or the agent of whatever happened. So I was not the agent of that moment. And in that sense, this kind of detection of deviations between prediction and observation does really seem to match this task where participants are asked to detect deviations from their movements. But beyond this match at the intuitive level, I want to go today in this talk a little bit deeper and try to establish relationships between motor metacognition and agency. And I'll do that in two ways, by showing two different studies. One where we basically applied metacognitive methods to try to understand and hopefully inform studies of agency. And a second study where we applied models of metacognition to try to understand at what hierarchy of processing judgments of agency happen. So let's start with the first study, where the link is rather methodological. So in our lab, we've been studying motor metacognition using what we call the Skittles task. The Skittles task is a virtual version of a real world game. I'm told it's a drinking game. I never saw it in real life, but there's a ball hanging from a post, so hanging with a rope from the top of a post. And the task is to swing the ball around the post to hit the target that's standing behind it. This is also called Skittle, that's why the Skittles task. And this is, as I said, a real game, but in our lab, we have a virtual version of that. And participants, what they actually do is that they place their forearms on on this horizontal metal bar that rotates around the axis. So it rotates around the elbow here. They close their fingers at the end of that horizontal bar. And in order to, so when they close the finger, they grab a ball, so to speak. And when they open the finger, the ball is released. So it feels a little bit naturalistic. You get used to it, and you do feel that there is some ecological validity to the task. It's an adaptation of a series of motor tasks that started being developed in 2004. For participants, the task looks like this. They see the scene on the screen from a bird's eye view. So they see the central pole, their forearm, or the horizontal bar that they're holding, and this moves online with their movement. They see the ball and they see the target that's standing behind it. And the ball is intended to fly in this direction. And for us, the task looks like this. We can draw what we call the outcome space. And the nice thing of this task is that it's deterministic. There are two parameters that fully determine the trajectory of the task. And those are the angle of release and the speed of release. So at which point you released it and how fast you were going when you released it. That's as simple as that. And we can plot for every combination of ball release parameters, we can plot the distance or the minimum distance between the ball and the target. So essentially we can estimate whether the ball hit the target, and if not, how far away it went or it passed. And we see that there are a few different regions. So these gray regions are parts where the ball did not hit the target, or hit the pole. These white regions correspond to places where, or to combinations of ball release parameters where the ball did hit the target. And here, these grayscale areas correspond to combinations where the ball did not hit the target, but missed it by a given distance and did not hit the central pole. I'll come back to this outcome space plot later. But I want to emphasize that the nice thing, as I said, about the motor task is that it's simultaneously simple because it's only two parameters that fully determine the trajectory of the ball, but it's also richly paired to effects and outcomes because we can manipulate by small or interesting manipulations in the release parameters, we can manipulate the outcome in categorical ways. So one of the questions that we asked using this task was whether action outcome improves metacognitive representations. And the reasoning behind asking this question was the following. When we're throwing a ball, when we're making a goal-oriented movement, we probably don't care about how exactly we moved our arm, where exactly we opened our hand to release the ball. All we care about is whether the ball hit the target. And that's what we probably should be caring for when we have a metacognitive representation of our movement. A little bit like the guitar learning example. It doesn't really matter how exactly I move my finger, but whether the note that I produced was what I really wanted to do. And so to test this hypothesis, we asked participants to do the Skittles task. The metacognitive version of the Skittles task looks like this. Participants make a throw, so they use that horizontal bar to throw the ball in this direction. As the ball is flying, we hide the target, so they don't see in the screen whether the ball hit the target or not, but they see the ball trajectory. And then they see on the type 1 decision, they see two alternative trajectories. One that corresponds to the movement they actually made, and one alternative trajectory that differs by a certain quantity that I will explain soon. Finally, they make a type 2 decision. So they judge their confidence in this discrimination task. sorry, I should say, they have to discriminate which of these two trajectories corresponds to the one that they actually induced with their movement. If you see this again fits into the general structure of a metacognitive task with a type 1 decision, a type 1 discrimination decision, and a type 2 confidence rating. We tested participants in two conditions, same and different outcome. And it's always very difficult to say this in words because it becomes a mouthful, but I think it's much more clear to see it just with a little picture. So here, it's essentially a 2x2 design where participants could have hit the target or missed it. And if they had hit the target, then they could have been in the same outcome condition or in the different outcome condition. If they hit the target and were in the same outcome condition, then we made sure that the alternative trajectory that we presented had also hit the target. And if it had been in a different outcome condition, then we made sure that the alternative trajectory missed the target whereas they had hit it. And I see a couple of nods, so I'm going to hope that this is clear enough. If I keep talking, it's going to be a mix of words. But
can I interrupt with a clarification question, or should we leave that to the end?
No, please do.
So just one small question. They see the trajectory of the ball, right? They just don't see the target. So would you consider this a task of a motor metacognition or perceptual metacognition? Because to me, it seems I'm a very poor metacognitive motor person. I don't think I'm very good at judging my movements and what it would produce. But if I would see the target of the ball and then my task is to say which was the trajectory, then wouldn't that be more of a perceptual task?
Yeah, that's a good point. So in this particular case, I should be calling this a visual motor task. We have a different experiment, I'm not going to talk about it today, where we did not show the trajectory and really forced people to concentrate only on motor information.
Thank you.
Okay, so the important aspect of this task and how we manipulated it was that we can, as I mentioned before, we can use and exploit the outcome space to, I think, quite nicely manipulate the difficulty of the task. So here, imagine that one participant had released their ball with this combination of release parameters. Then we have two options. We can either show an alternative trajectory that has these release parameters, so we only vary the speed of release and not the angle. And if we do that, we can find an alternative trajectory that also misses the target by a given distance. But we can also choose to go down and show an alternative trajectory where the ball does hit the target. But if you notice, the outcome changes between these two things. So in one case, the alternative trajectory misses a target just as the actual participants throw in. In the other case, it hits the target, but the velocity difference between these two is exactly the same. So we're manipulating task difficulty measured as difference in velocity of release independently from the outcome information. So let's go directly to results, which are actually relatively straightforward. We find a basic effect of outcome, a very strong effect of outcome, where participants did use, so participants could benefit from the outcome related information. So essentially, when the two trajectories differed on whether they had hit the target or not, participants were consistently better at discriminating the task. They were also, in agreement with that, they also had higher confidence ratings. But at the metacognitive level, we did not find any difference. So these are M ratio estimates, and we did not find any evidence, or in fact, we found evidence for the null hypothesis that there was no specific improvement at the metacognitive level. So this was a first indication that perhaps our initial hypothesis was simply wrong. The participants are not necessarily incorporating the outcome information at the metacognitive level, but you will notice that, I was a little bit unhappy with this very strong and very systematic difference in D prime. Of course, M ratio should account for that, but having two different conditions where we're comparing with such a strong difference was not the same. So we repeated this experiment. Instead of 37 participants, we now have 28 participants. We fixed a few issues in the staircase. And we get more or less the same result. So we still do find a difference in D prime, but now much more reduced. I'm a little bit happier with the manipulation in this second study, but it still does show that the outcome information is processed. So essentially, the manipulation worked. We also get higher confidence ratings in conditions where the outcome was different. And again, we find no evidence for any kind of improvement that's specific to the metacognitive level. So outcome information did not seem to affect the representation or the precision of the metacognitive representations of participants' low-level information. So I want to reiterate that. Participants were able to make judgments about, or to make metacognitive judgments about low-level aspects of their movement, essentially the speed at which they threw a ball, but they did not seem to benefit or incorporate outcome information about it. So what? Well, I think this does say something, or that this might be helpful to think about agency studies. And I'm not going to be the first one to say this. I think these results go very much in line with Tick's paper that was published in 2019, where they argued the following. Agency studies and the comparator model was actually developed originally for very, very low level predictions about the consequences of one's movements. So this, if I'm not mistaken, was stemmed from research in pufferfish, where one eye was rotated 180 degrees, and that led the fish to swim in circles. So essentially, the comparator model really is a result of very tightly coupled predictions of what you expect to see when you move in a given way. However, in human studies, we don't rotate anybody's eyes. What we do is that we build experimental manipulations where we pair things arbitrarily. So we ask people to press a button, and then they see a blue or a red patch appearing on the screen. And these arbitrary associations also, the authors here argue that these arbitrary associations also lead to some kind of prediction error and a mismatch between what is predicted and observed. There's no question about this. But these two levels in the brain might operate based on different mechanisms. So there is no real reason to assume that these two things depend on the same cognitive or neural architectures. And in that sense, we should not be just assuming that our manipulations in humans really talk to or really correspond to these kinds of more bodily related prediction errors. And I think that our results are in line with this, whereas because we showed that there seems to be some kind of lack of communication or lack of benefit when we manipulate something at this level, so when we manipulated the outcome of an action at this level, and participants could still equally well access something that was closer to the body, like velocity of release or trajectory of a ball, as Leah pointed out. So essentially a consequence of the movement that's much closer to what we actually did with our bodies rather than a completely arbitrary association. Again, we're not the first ones to try or to ask this question. There has been one paper in 2016 where they compared more or less along the same lines people's judgment of agency. So was it me or was it somebody else who made this movement? By manipulating visual feedback at two different levels, either showing the hand moving in a slightly different way or showing the outcome of that hand movement that was a tone following pressing a button. Also, so essentially they manipulated either that arbitrary pairing or something a lot closer, which was a hand moving. And they found the judgment of agency or proportion of times that people said, yes, that was me, had a different profile for one manipulation or the other. And I think this is very interesting, but again, I think if we think back into metacognitive paradigms, we might realize that these kind of detection tasks, which is essentially a detection task, so it's a detection of deviation, suffers from some biases that discrimination tasks don't. I am not here to argue that we should be using always discrimination tasks in agency, but I think that we might learn from research in metacognition to think whether we can do some things different in agency. And in particular, we might be able to better compare agency sensitivity and precision of representations at different levels if we take what is essentially a standardized measure of metacognition of agency. And that's exactly what we're going to do. So the future plans are to try to, the study I presented now was not initially thought in a context of agency, but now we will start doing 2 interval forced choice tasks where we ask participants to make 2 movements and ask them which of the 2 they had more agency over. Give me a moment. So on that note, this kind of new operationalization or new kind of paradigm is exactly what we've done in experiment 2, or in the second experiment that I want to show you today. Here we used models of confidence to try to understand at which level judgments of agency happen or are processed. So a couple of years ago, we were asked, I think Steve asked us the question, are judgments of agency metacognitive, and whether we wanted to contribute the book chapter in his book. And we were happy to do that. Together with Valerian Chambon and Patrick Haggard, we wrote a chapter arguing that yes, judgments of agency are metacognitive. And I think what we wrote is correct, but I disagree with the question we asked now. I mean, now looking back. The question we asked was the following. We said there seem to be some components of judgment of agency that are retrospective, because people can be fooled to think that they have agency when they didn't really. And therefore, perhaps these judgments of agency don't reflect anything about a subjective experience. They just are some kind of heuristic, reconstructive judgment about the general thing that we've seen. In this book chapter, very shortly put, we said, no, yes, that's not the whole story. So judgments of agency are at least partially metacognitive because they do refer to a true subjective experience. And we do seem to be able to report it to some extent, even if it's contaminated by some retrospective and reconstructive aspects. But what I mean that I disagree with the question is that here we were asking the question of whether judgments of agency were metacognitive by just saying, well, do they refer to some subjective experience? And therefore we were just thinking whether they were cognition about cognition in this very broad definition of metacognition. What we asked here in this study are whether judgments of agency are really metacognitive. And I put scare quotes here because what I want to say is, are they metacognitive in the same very strict way that we consider confidence to be metacognitive? And I think there's a value in this because now metacognition over the past few years, and thanks to Steve mostly because you've spearheaded the whole field with a really nice set, so with a great set of experiments. But we now, at least I feel that within this research field, metacognition really has been very tightly coupled with this kind of operationalization. And I think there's a real value to that, to have a terminological clarity about what we're talking about. And so in these kinds of paradigms of first order task followed by a second order task, a normative model says that confidence corresponds to the probability of having given a correct response given the evidence. And this model might not be the whole picture. There are a couple of papers challenging it, but it does predict something that seems to be true, which is that confidence is affected by sensory noise. So, and I apologize for these super tiny axis labels, I just realized it. Under this normative model, if we plot here mean confidence on the y-axis and evidence discriminability on the x-axis, that means the inverse of task difficulty, we find that confidence for correct trials should increase following this pattern and confidence for incorrect trials should decrease following this pattern. But crucially for our purposes today, the pattern and the divergence between correct and incorrect trials depends on noise. So for sharp representations, the confidence profiles will follow something like this. And the more we increase the noise, the more these two curves flatten and get closer together. And confidence, in other words, is affected by uncertainty in the signal. And one example of this is a PNAS paper by Dan Wang and Steve Fleming, where they shown that where they had participants do a visual task under two different levels of coherence or two different levels of noise. And they showed that behaviorally, participants' confidence increased more steeply with evidence discriminability, so with the reverse of task difficulty, when with high coherence, as it's labeled here, or with low perceptual noise. So we're going to use this kind of interaction effect between noise and on confidence between noise and evidence discriminability to test our predictions of whether judgments of agency are affected by noise. And the last thing I want to say, sort of as an introductory slide to this study, is that what we did is, the last thing we needed to do was to bring these two things together. So the comparator model had to be squeezed into signal detection, into a signal detection theory framework. So all we did was put signal detection curves everywhere. Now we think that the predicted sensory input is a noisy signal, which makes sense. We have some noise associated with our predictions. It's not just a point estimate. The observed sensory input is, of course, also a noisy signal. And this is something that we can manipulate. So we can manipulate the noise of this observed sensory input. And now the mismatch between these two will obviously also be a noisy signal. That depends on the noise of this distribution, because this is the one that we're going to manipulate. And the idea now is that whenever participants, so if participants draw a sample from this distribution on a given trial where there is a very strong mismatch between what they predicted and what they observed, they will say, well, that probably wasn't me, because what happened was not what I predicted would happen. So it's essentially a signal detection task. And so we're going to manipulate the observed outcome. Here in red is a situation with low noise. In blue is a situation with high noise. And now we're going to test whether mean judgments of agency are a function only of the mean of this signal. So essentially the mean delay or the mean manipulation between between the mean alteration that we present to a stimulus, or whether they're also a function of the noise of the signal. Okay, so the first thing we needed to do was to find a way to manipulate noise in an agency task. So in the first task that we tested, we asked participants to put their hand under a leap motion tracker. You might have seen something like this. It's a little infrared camera that tracks your hand, and you can use it to present a model of a hand that moves along with your hand. Works pretty nicely. Of course, the benefit of this task was that we were studying agency, again, in a situation that was a little bit closer to the body. But I have to say, in principle, we could have tested this kind of predictions also in a more removed and perhaps a little bit more standard and more straightforward, frankly, agency manipulation. But essentially what we did was ask participants on each trial to make two movements. So they had to curl their finger once and curl their finger again. One of these two movements was shown in sync with their movement on the screen. So there was no temporal delay associated. And in the other one, we did introduce a delay. Participants' first order task was to judge whether the first or the second, or whether they had felt more agency in the first or second interval, and then give a measure of confidence. So this is a proper metacognitive task, again, 2 IFC followed by confidence. And we tested participants under two perceptual conditions, low noise and high noise. Low noise was a white hand against a black background that was pretty easy to see. And the high noise condition, the hand looked more like a shade. So it was perceptually harder to see. I want to emphasize that we manipulated signal reliability without changing the signal itself, because the signal itself was the delay. The two intervals differed only on whether we introduced a delay between the display and the hand movement, but we did not manipulate that when we manipulated noise. And when we look at the results, we find basically a basic effect of noise. We find that in the high noise condition, accuracy in the first order task was lower. And we find an interaction in confidence between in confidence between the response accuracy and noise. Here, the difference for low noise between correct and incorrect trials was higher than the difference in high noise between correct and incorrect trials. And this all makes sense. It's not surprising, but it's reassuring. All it shows is that perceptual noise reduced accuracy, so reduced both accuracy and the effect of accuracy on confidence. And it's what we expected from our experimental manipulation, but it also shows us that we are now entitled to call this low noise and high noise. So to call these two conditions as low and high noise under a signal detection theory framework. Now, with this manipulation under our sleeve, we can now move on to do a proper agency task. The same participants did tasks 1 and task 2, but now here I'm going to show you the analysis of only those participants that showed an effect of noise. So let me go back here. This is for all 47 participants, but in order to ensure that we were really looking at a manipulation that was what happened, we reduced the sample to only those participants that showed the effect, that basic effect. And here in this task, we ask participants to do a single movement, curling finger, and then rate agency, very standard agency manipulation. And instead of staircasing the difference, what was the difference between two delays, between two displays, we had a fixed set of delays introduced. So let's look at the behavioral effects. We find that mean judgments of agency vary with delay, so they decrease with delay, as we would have expected. And there seems to be an effect of noise. So for high noise, the slope is a little bit slower. It's a little bit less steep. That is in line with a prediction that perhaps noise does affect judgments of agency. And these, by the way, are predictions from linear mixed models and on a single trial level. But okay, beyond this qualitative effect of noise, we can actually make quantitative predictions because we have a quantitative model of confidence. So we built two models that were compatible with this crossover effect. We reasoned that there are at least two ways in which noise could affect judgments of agency. They might affect them in just like confidence is affected, so in a strictly and strongly metacognitive sense. So we reason that if judgments of agency are metacognitive, they will behave like confidence does as the probability of having given a correct response given the evidence. And these models look like this. I won't go into many details, but they increase with signal strength, and they follow the shape of confidence where because they increase linearly with the probability of having given a correct response, the criteria that we find or that we set for different confidence levels are not equidistant. And this is what we call the Bayesian model. But there are other ways in which agency or judgment of agency might behave, and they might not be metacognitive. And this is under this rescaling model, what we said is, look, perhaps judgments of agency actually scale with the internal signal strength. So they're not really affected by noise. They are just the degree of mismatch between what is observed and what is predicted. And because we wanted to account for those qualitative behavioral results where there is a crossover effect, what we said is perhaps there is a rescaling in which the criteria get stretched to match the furthest points in the distribution, but they are not stretched in any, but that doesn't mean that they get affected by noise in any metacognitive sense. They still are equidistant criteria because they still scale with the internal signal strength and not with the probability of correct. They are just affected by noise in this rather trivial way. I think this is a little bit clearer to see what this means in signal detection terms, but in practical terms, what this means is that participants, is that for a given participant, a judgment of agency of 1 might not have corresponded to the same perceived delay in the low illumination condition, so in the high noise condition relative to the low noise condition. And that means I compared dark, so let's call them dark and bright, dark trials versus dark trials, and bright trials versus bright trials. We tried to prevent this by interleaving trials, but the visual manipulation was so obvious, so participants knew which kind of trial they were seeing. This does remain a possibility. These two models, the Bayesian model and the rescaling model, make slightly different predictions, but they both predict this crossing over effect. But when we look at the predictions for trial counts for each judgment of agency rating following and corresponding to each delay, the two models, Bayesian and rescaling, do differ. I won't go into details here. I just want to show you because I think that let me go one slide back. From this plot here, it's not very clear which kind of differences are we testing and how can we distinguish these two models, given that they actually look pretty similar, but they aren't that similar. They actually do make different predictions on the profile of judgment of agency for any given delay presented. Yeah, that's it. So now we simply fit our data to the prediction of these two models, and we find that actually the rescaling model was much better at explaining the data. And this was not because it was a more parsimonious model, and in fact, it had one additional parameter. So this is not only true, so I'm only showing the group level data here, but this was also true for 31 out of the 32 participants when we looked at the data on a single participant level. So to answer the question very directly, can a model of confidence explain judgment of agency? Actually, poorly. Agency might be more related to first order information than it is to metacognitive information. And I think this is a nice test because often something I forgot to say when I started talking about this study is that that agency is a metacognitive judgment, or that agency is a metacognitive process, is often one of the first sentences of a paper. It's somehow an assumption. And it makes sense because judgments of agency are a judgment about some presumably valid subjective experience. But now that we have a much clearer meaning and a much tighter and computational and neural meaning for metacognition, it might be worth splitting hairs and thinking a little bit carefully about these things. So to summarize, I've shown you in 2 studies today how I've related motor metacognition to agency. And I think that, so in the first study, I've shown that movement outcome does not increase the precision of our motor representations. And I just want to argue that there seems to be a dissociation between these 2 levels. They cannot be taken to correspond to always be matched and correspond to the same thing. And in the second study, I used models of confidence to ask whether judgment of agency may be metacognitive in a very strict sense. And we argue that the answer is no, and argue then for terminological clarity about metacognition. We might think that we should not co-opt and not only type 1, type 2 tasks. So not only this operationalization of metacognition is allowed to keep the term metacognition, that's fine, but I think we should call these 2 things differently. And that's my final slide. I want to thank you for your attention, the rest of my wonderful, really nice group, and funders. And that's it.
Great, thank you so much, Elisa. So we should